Uh, and in another way, I don't think it's that far away. I've always thought of myself as somebody who was, as a writer, who wanted to be emotionally invasive. I never wanted the book to just sit there in a reader's lap. I wanted the reader to grasp the book until his knuckles turned white. I wanted it to provoke a physical reaction, whether it's laughter, screams, terror, goosebumps, or tears. Tears of sorrow and tears of loss. Any of those feelings are just fine with me. But I would like for the reader to close that book and know that I was there.
Out in isolated Portland, Maine, on September 21st, 1947, Stephen Edward King was born. This had been a surprise considering that his mother, Nellie Ruth Pillsbury King, was told she could no longer bear children. He was born into a modern family of the 50s, but unexpectedly, his father, Donald King, stepped outside for a pack of cigarettes and never returned home. To a family that was already economically troubled, this was a disaster. However, King later stated that his mother landed on her feet scrambling. My brother and I didn't see a great deal of her love over the next 9 years. For the time being, Nellie took whatever job she could manage to support her family with. This meant constant travel. Maine, Massachusetts, Illinois, Wisconsin, Indiana, and Connecticut were all destinations for which the King stayed with relatives and family. The constant environment change affected the King brothers, who would make better friends with each other than with anyone else. When they got lonely, which happened often, Dave and Stephen read to each other comic books and stories with suspense and heroes. Stephen spent most of his time tapped into his already active imagination. Eventually the family settled in Durham, Maine. Durham had a population of less than 900 at the time, and was described as a working-class town, a hard-luck town. Right around here was farming, but the majority of towners went out of town to Lewiston, Auburn, or Brunswick. Here, King began to try writing on his own. He added to the comics he read, and he wrote articles for his older brother's local newspaper. This never sold over 20 copies, but it was an early start for the young writer. As he got older, King definitely stood out, not only with his imagination, but he was an impressive 6 feet 2 inches. King's best school friend Chris Chesley described King like a kid who's old with those old-fashioned black-rimmed glasses. He was kind of slow and chunky, but not fat. Stephen always had his face in a book and tried even further at writing. After spending a night at the Ritz seeing the movie The Pit and the Pendulum, he published a self-novelization on his brother's mimeograph machine, which he sold at school. Surprisingly, he sold 70 copies at a dime a book, another successful early start for the future writer. Around the time of King's childhood, science fiction was the popular genre. However, King never wrote science fiction too well at the early age. King found his niche when looking through his aunt and uncle's attic. He found a box of books once owned by his father. Books were mostly cheap paperbacks written by the famous supernatural author Howard Phillips Lovecraft. Lovecraft became a huge influence for King. What King really drew out of Lovecraft's works was that they were all based in New England, the area of which King lived. Chesley would later explain, what Stephen learned from Lovecraft was the possibility of taking New England atmosphere and using that as a springboard. Lovecraft showed him a milieu that was definitely New England horror. Dracula could be moved to Durham, basically. King then began to write his first series of stories that he would publish for his favorite science fiction magazines, Fantastic and the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction. King would create stories about what he was influenced by. One of the major influences was the threat of atomic war between Russia. This technology would be the fuel for many writers in creating transmuted bugs and human monsters. Authors like Ray Bradbury, author of the many famous novels such as The Martian Chronicles, And Isaac Asimov, author of I, Robot, popularized the science fiction genre that King devoured on a daily basis and was seen here in his writing. However, despite his talent, he would get rejection slip upon rejection slip. He nailed a spike to the wall and struck his ever-growing pile of rejection slips to it. In 1962, King continued his passion for writing straight into high school, commuted to Libsyn High School because Durham only had a handful of kids. In 1963, King and Chesley decided to write and publish their own short story compilation called People, Places, and Things, Volume 1. Using David's mimeograph machine from the newspaper days, the boys wrote and ran 8 stories by King and 9 stories by Chesley. A final story was a cooperation between the two. In 1964, King and the amateur publishing agent Triad and Gaslight published King's The Star Invader, which was inspired by the science fiction genre King loved. King kept on writing with no signs of slowing. A year later, King wrote I Was a Teenage Grave Robber, playing on the new books I Was a Teenage Werewolf and I Was a Teenage Frankenstein.